What's up everybody, blessed be. My name is Manon and you're watching Witchin' and Working, where we will be discovering all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. First thing I wanted to mention that I apologize for the slowdown in my content. Like I was saying before, I'm going through a major life transition. It's not a bad life transition, it's a very good life transition. Not all transitions are bad. The only thing is, you know what? The bottom line is, I'd say come March, mid-March, I'll be right back on track making a video once a week, as I was doing before this fireball hit my life. So that being said, let's get into this next video. When we first get into the craft, it can be quite overwhelming, and in fact, it can be extremely overwhelming for a lot of us. There's so many different juicy little paths that stray off in 1,000 different directions, and many times when we're beginners, we find ourselves straddling multiple roads or standing at a crossroads more often than we want to. Take your time and have patience. This is a lifetime journey and meant to be experienced slowly and the teachings soaked in. One of the most common tips, and any witch worth their weight in frankincense will tell you, is to read, read, read. Well, many of you have been asking me what books do I recommend for beginners, and this is my list to you. So let's roll the intro and get into it. Welcome back everybody. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important practices you can do to grow as a witch on this path is to read books and texts that will teach you who, what, when, where, why, and how all of this wonderful world of the occult revolves. As a beginner, this is all you have. Grasp onto these texts and read anything and everything you can get your hands on. There's so much to learn in the occult world. I honestly don't believe one can learn everything in one lifetime. There's so much of this that can only be learned through experience, for that matter. But let's concentrate on Wicca and witchcraft. In this field of the occult alone, you can and will spend a lifetime truly experiencing and taking in the many, many concepts, theories, and beliefs that build the foundation blocks of this religio-magic and practice. And again, even the shell of these practices, such as the understanding of the Sabbats, Esbits, deities, the elemental forces, spells, rituals, energy work, shadow work, cycles of life, divination practices, path workings, meditation, visualization, coven work, solitaire work, history, beliefs, retribution, etc., etc. I could just keep going on for an entire video. It's all very important. Point being, there's a lot to know and a lot to go over, and you will never know everything, so don't even try, especially because we know that Wicca is always growing and expanding. So to be frank, you know a lot, but you'll always be seeking for what's around the corner. This is awesome as far as I'm concerned, as things should never really ever get boring. My high priestess used to tell us all the time, if you get bored, it's because you aren't playing in the right shadows. Okay, so as most of you know, I've been a practicing Wiccan for 30 years, 21 as a traditional Gardnerian, and 27 of those years teaching and running covens, both eclectic and traditional. All of that and $2 here in the state of Florida will get me on the bus. My point is, I have read a lot of books, a lot of books. One thing for sure, they will start to repeat themselves. What do I mean by this? Basically, if you have 20 books on Wicca or witchcraft, and witchcraft, they are pretty much gonna say the same thing, with the exception of little tidbits that authors can throw in as personal additions that they've experienced in their careers and ritual practice. The ritual will always be different in each of the books, but the concept for the ritual will relatively be the same, but the actual content of the sample rituals that the authors create will be as different as the personalities and creative justice each author exhibits. But reading these Wiccan and witchcraft concepts and ideas from multiple texts is great because, like I said, it's all ice cream, but the different flavors are what make it so good and ultimately drive these ideas and concepts home as you read them again and again. So again, don't be afraid to buy multiple books on the same subjects, as just basing your entire understanding off of one text can be damaging and flat out ignorant. perfect example, look at the Bible and its effect on its followers of our way or the highway syndrome. So most of the books I will be acknowledging, introducing, and recommending are older texts. I really like these older generation of books because many of them contain solid data and information that still dwelled in the roots of Wicca before society began to water down Wicca and witchcraft to the point of almost drowning it out. And trust me, coming from where I've been involving Wicca and seeing the directions so many Wiccan practices and concepts have taken, it makes us old timers cringe when seeing some of the new age practices and misdirections of today. Yeah, I totally just referred to myself as an old timer. Yeah, forget about that. Well, anyways, I've picked through some of the books that I grew up on, and I totally recommend them to you as research references to start with. Again, these are just a few books to start with. You should get multiple texts, as many as it takes to fill your cranial cauldron with what it needs. I'm going to go through these texts per subject and tell you why I like them. So let's get started with Wicca and witchcraft in general. By the way, disclaimer, I'm not saying that the older books are the only books to get. The newer books of today are awesome books also. It's just in my experience, a lot of the newer books of today that I've purchased and read, again, they tend to water down what Wicca, the core and the extremeness of what I'm used to and what I came up with. And I kind of enjoy that the older books tell it how it is and how it was and don't try to sugarcoat anything. That's what I'm saying. Not all of them are like that, just some of them. Okay. I totally recommend The Complete Book of Witchcraft by Raymond Buckland, published in 1986. This is also known in craft circles as the Big Blue Book and by other Gardnerians as Uncle Bucky's Big Blue Book because, yes, Raymond Buckland was in fact a fellow Gardnerian witch. This was one of the first books I ever read as a beginning witch. What I really love about this book is that it is a great resource that goes over the very basics of Wicca and witchcraft and then some. I love that it starts off with the history of witchcraft and then progresses from there with a confident structure moving through the different techniques, tools, and belief systems involved in Wicca. The book is a very easy read and explains things in a very easy to understand method, and many times Raymond uses examples to help explain Wiccan concepts and beliefs, and at times tries to slide a little humor in there too, but well, you can be the judge of that yourself. Ray uses illustrations throughout the book that are extremely helpful in some of the practices he explains, which are very helpful, especially because some of the things he gets into, to be frank, I don't think they could be explained without an illustration of some sort. From history, he moves on methodically towards the beliefs, deities, and a lot of the concepts of Wicca that make it a religion. He dabbles into each concept just enough to explain it in general, but also enough to where you understand what it is we work with, how, and why. Once he has used a few chapters to explain the religious side of Wicca, he moves on to explaining and delving into witchcraft and its many practices. As I've explained in the video linked above and in the description below, Wicca and witchcraft are different beasts. Wicca is a religion, whereas witchcraft is a practice. Now, most all Wiccans are witches, but not all witches are Wiccan. Yep, just check out the first episode of my channel after the video if you haven't already done so for a better explanation. Ultimately, Ray dives into numerology, pagan names, meditation, visualization, spell working, and the what's, hows, and whys behind it. And he even gets into Sabbat work with demonstrated rituals for the 8 Sabbats and full and new moon Esbits. At some point, he even gets into and dabbles a bit with some of the more taboo natures of Wicca, such as skycab practice and some of the traditions, for instance. I guess the reason I like this book so much is because it's a very well-rounded book that goes over a large platter of beliefs, concepts, and workings throughout both Wicca and witchcraft together. As a Wiccan reading this book, you can thoroughly relax and enjoy, as this book is all 100% Wicca to its core, whether traditional or eclectic. As a practitioner who doesn't follow Wicca, you too will get a shit ton from this book, but be warned, some of the chapters are religious in nature, but regardless, well worth the read. Also, Raymond Buckland has a video out that correlates with this book called Witchcraft Yesterday and Today. Definitely worth checking this out also. The next book I'd like to get into and introduce is another Wicca witchcraft book called The Witch's Bible, published in 1996. This book is actually two books that were combined into one book, and originally these two books were called The Witch's Way and 8 Sabbats for Witches. These were combined into one, and to be honest, just get the one book, as the two combined are what make this book an amazing read. The Witch's Bible was written by the Alexandrian husband and wife team named Janet and Stewart Farrar. Alexandrian witchcraft was the first British traditional witchcraft branch that was created from Gerald Gardner's witchcraft, which his witchcraft was labeled Gardnerian witchcraft for obvious reasons. Alex Saunders took Gerald's rituals and created his own style of witchcraft because, well, to be frank, he wasn't allowed to join a traditional Gardnerian coven because of his attitude, so he just created his own once he got his hands on Gerald's structure and rites. Either way, I totally love this book because, again, like the previous book discussed, it covers so many Wiccan concepts and beliefs that were core to the traditions and without the watering down effect so prevalent in many of today's texts. This book is very intense and no nonsense. It's definitely a little more extreme of a read than Uncle Bucky's The Complete Book of Witchcraft, but just as fun and super, super informative. The Farrars were an amazing priest and priestess who opened up to the world a lot of traditional practice and gave examples of what Wicca and witchcraft really embraced. I remember the first time I read this book, I was completely flooded with the information that was being demonstrated and explained, and some of it went over my head at the time, but once I was initiated as a traditional witch, I went back and read it again, and all the loose puzzle pieces that went over my head began to fall into place. This book, again, is actually two books in one, with the second half explaining the basics of Wicca and witchcraft and getting into the history, the philosophies, the beliefs, and the traditional practices. This is done with a great talent for writing and an easy to understand literary technique that was perfect for my mindset anyways. And I don't want you to think I'm contradicting myself because I just got done mentioning how some of the content went over my head. It's not that I didn't understand what was being explained and taught, it's just that I didn't jive with some of the stuff at the time of reading it as a non-initiate. Once initiated, I had a better understanding of some of the concepts, and with a good return read, the once foreign concepts now clicked with me, and I enjoyed the book even that much more. The second half of the book also gets into sample rituals that are much more intense than in Raymond Buckland's book, and very clear and concise in their direction and accomplishments. The first half of the book, 8 Sabbats for Witches, is exactly about that. The 8 Sabbats that Wiccans and witches follow and celebrate. Again, the Farrars do an amazing job explaining the history, concepts, and reasoning behind each celebration, and also include a ritual that can be done to celebrate yourself. Unfortunately, the rituals they show are for coven practice, if I'm not mistaken, so they involve multiple peoples and parts, but with some imagination on your part, they can be modified to a solitaire practitioner too. This book also has great illustrations explaining a lot of the concepts and practices, and conveniently and tastefully has an entire middle section with actual in-ritual photos of traditional practices that separate the two books from each other. All in all, totally recommend this book as a second book on modern day Wicca and witchcraft that cuts right into the core and keeps everything thick and rich with tradition with no watered down aftertaste of diet Wicca. Okay, so that's two books specifically on Wicca that I totally recommend and love. So let's get into a few other subjects that I recommend and feel everyone should know if you're a practicing witch. The next book I'm going to recommend is The Sabbats by Adaine McCoy, published in 1994. This book is one of the, if not the best book I've ever read about the 8 Sabbat celebrations. Adaine completely gets into the nitty-gritty of each Sabbat and goes over the history and meanings of each one. She literally dives into multiple historical activities and traditions from multiple cultures and explains who, what, when, where, whys, and hows of each Sabbat. Almost everything I know about the Sabbats is because of this book on a large part. It's one of the best resources I know of for learning the ins and outs of our sacred celebrations, and in turn even teaches quite a bit in why we celebrate and have certain customs we perform during non-pagan holidays today, such as Easter egg hunts, decorating Christmas trees, Valentine's Day, maypole dances, trick-or-treating, and much, much more. It's a super fun book to read and an amazing resource, especially when creating your own ritual for Sabbats. Also, Adaine incorporates sample ritual for each Sabbat for both solitaire and coven work. She's some of the best ritual I've seen come from authors, and I've personally performed every group Sabbat ritual in her book. Great text, trust me, get it. On to the next completely amazing book that I recommend everyone owns and utilizes often, and this is the complete book of Incense, Oils, and Brews from Scott Cunningham, published in 1986. I can't say enough about this book. As you have seen in some of my previous videos, anytime I create an incense, oil, or brew, most of the time, not all of the time, I will reference this book for a recipe corresponding to the celebration or working at hand. I literally keep Scott's book on my apothecary shelf. It stays there for quick reference when creating any of my witchy concoctions. This is my most used book, and you can tell as it's fallen apart a couple of times over the years, but still intact enough to give me what I need. I really should get another one, but I'm kind of lazy about it. Anyway, Scott talks about creating different incense concoctions, oils, teas, poppets, herbal sachets, soaps, powders, brews, ointments. I mean, he really does hit it all. He even gets into making magical inks. And in each category, he gives recipes for just about every circumstance you can encounter. Health, love, luck, specific deities, planetaries, courage, happiness, etc., etc. I mean, he really covers it all. And what I really like is if his recipe says it calls for dragon's blood and you don't have any, in the table in the back of the book, there's a section of substitutes that can be used per herb. For instance, a substitute for dragon's blood is equal parts frankincense and red sandalwood. So yes, Scott Cunningham's complete book of incense, oils, and brews. Get it. A must-have in my humble opinion. So you may be wondering at this point why I haven't mentioned any direct Gardnerian text, since my heart lies with the Gardnerian witchcraft. There's a pretty good reason for this, and it's because there just aren't many books in publication about Gardnerian witchcraft, specifically because it's an oath-bound tradition of witchcraft. Joe Gardner himself wrote a few books on witchcraft in general back in the day, which includes Witchcraft Today and The Meaning of Witchcraft. These books are definitely recommended reads, but not priority, as they are very dry and difficult reads, and to be honest, just aren't very fun. Informative for sure, but definitely I don't feel like good reads for a beginner. They are definitely a more advanced text. This being said, for those of you interested in Gardnerian specific Wicca and the roots of modern day Wicca in general, I would totally recommend Wiccan Roots by Philip Heselton. Philip lives in England and is himself a fellow Gardnerian witch who has gone through the mill and painstaking research to help explain where a lot of our present day practice came from and who, what, when, and where Gardnerian tradition, and therefore Wicca in general, was resurrected from in its rebirth, so to speak. He literally goes into depth in helping to show with evidence that Gerald did not create the whole thing. A great read for those of us looking to seek the foundations of Wicca. Philip has a few follow-up books to Wiccan Roots that carry on his ongoing research, called Witchfather, The Life of Gerald Gardner, and Gerald Gardner and the Cauldron of Inspiration. All great reads for those inclined. Another book I recommend, which again is very old but worth the read because it explains a lot about where we come from, is Margaret Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe, published in 1921. Another great older text I recommend every witch to own is Eridia, or Gospel of the Witches, written by Charles Leland Godfrey in 1899. Very cool little book that mostly talks about a Strigarian Italian style of witchcraft, but demonstrates the charge of the goddess, which is used to this day in Wiccan circles around the world. A few more books I want to mention are as follows, and they are by no means any less in my passion and love for them. I'm just running out of time for this video, so I'm going to mention them and give a quick blurb on what they're about, and then move on. I'll put a list of all those books in the description below, so don't worry if you miss one or two or can't write them down fast enough. Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs by Scott Cunningham, another one of Scott's reference books that gets into amazing detail of the wide and wondrous world of herbs, plants, and trees and their magical properties. This book teams well with the complete book of Incense, Oils, and Brews. Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Crystals, Gems, and Metal Magic. Again, another reference book from Scott that has an amazing information on the many crystals, gems, and metals that many of us witches utilize so often in our practice. Since we are covering this foundation of references and text, I'm going to throw in Jude's Herbal Home Remedies, written by Jude C. Todd. This book has a plethora of home remedy recipes that are both extremely useful and very fun to make at the same time. From teas for headache to rubs and cough drops for colds, this book has it all for you to create your own homegrown remedies. The Candle Magic Workbook, written by Kayla Pagan. This book is an incredible reference for candles in all of their many forms, color correspondences, types, sizes, different waxes, and how and why to burn them. This book I definitely recommend for beginners, and check out my candle magic video above also. The Living World of Fairy by R.J. Stewart. There are so many misconceptions and falsities about the otherworldly beings that intermingle with us pretty much on a daily basis, especially those that are closest to our vibrational realm, which is the fairy beings. R.J. Stewart is one of the leading experts on the fairy realm to date, and I completely recommend this book to debunk and give you the hard cash reality of the fairy realm, and hopefully get you past the common standard bullshit that so many toss around on the internet, whom have never even worked with the fae, let alone understand how they coincide with us humans. Great book, check it out. Moon Magic by DJ Conway. This book is all about the moon phases and what they represent. Even better, it gets into the 12, sometimes 13 moons throughout the year and goes into detail about each one, as well as demonstrates sample ritual to celebrate each of the full and new moon rites. This is one of the best books I've read that has to do with moon magic. Craft, Witchcraft for 3 or More by Amber K. This book is all about coven work for those of you who are interested in that style of witchcraft. This is a great source for ideas, rituals, lessons, and tips on how to form your own coven to practice Wicca or witchcraft. Animals Speak by Ted Andrews. This book is all about finding and journeying with your animal totem spirit. I completely recommend this book and this practice, as it is a relatively harmless but direct exercise in opening up to the other planes and receiving messages from the worlds that are not directly seen or heard. Finally, the Encyclopedia of Witches and Witchcraft by Rosemary Ellen Gilly. This is just a great resource for finding and researching all of the ins and outs of not just witches and witchcraft, but just about anything and everything you can commonly come across within the occult world. As far as I'm concerned, this book should be on every witch's shelf. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Witch Into Working. I hope you enjoyed my personal suggestions on some books that I think every witch should own. And again, this is just my take on it. Do you have any books you may recommend? Please list them down in the comments below. If you're enjoying my content, please click that subscribe button and ring that little bell to be reminded of future episodes to come. I look forward to seeing you all again next week for a new and exciting episodes of Witch Into Working. I love you guys and gals. Blessed be.